Hello, friends. Today's interview is with Dr. Mark Weisman. He is more than a doctor. He's a former Christian pastor who has transitioned into being a Norse shaman. This discussion is about Norse spirituality. It's about civilization and how it has been formed under the precepts and rules of specific dominant religions. It is about the spirituality that you walk around with every single day. It's educational. It's an interesting story about a man who's truly come into himself as a person who has traveled the road of ancestry. And so enjoy a wonderful, thoughtful conversation today on Mindful Mutiny. Mark, I'd like to start with something that really jumped out to me in this. I'd like for you to talk about your journey from Christianity into um, being a follower of Odin and Freya.
Yes, that journey is not as long as one might think. There's even in Christianity, there's obviously the understanding of universal truths that lie beneath our spiritual practices, our spiritual understandings that we come to embrace. My my struggles with the Christian practice was that it was based more on practice and less on the actual spiritual teachings.
Right.
So much of the Christianity is thou shalt do this and do that and do it this way. And it really didn't allow, and it doesn't have the flexibility of really truly exploring and embracing the totality of of our spiritual journeys, of our spiritual paths. And so I struggled um, even during seminary and beyond. Once I got out into the world, I was a chaplain, and I began working. Most often, I was working with men and women who were returning from combat assignments, helping them to build living mechanisms for their traumatic stress disorder. And through this practice, I more and more I kept finding more and more holes in the doctrine, in the ideology of the spiritual practice that wrapped around um, Christianity. It was 2016 when I received my first vision. My first visions were of lights, and they were a bundled little group of lights. These lights would go on. I would learn were the spirits of the land, the Landvedi, who had come to advise me of my true calling, of my true path. Those lights led almost a year and a half later. I would fall into a trance. And I would meet my great grandfather, whom would then begin a process of enlightening me, of educating me, of teaching me the ways of not of Norse originally, but of spirituality, kind of releasing me from the confines of Christianity that I had become trained in. And as these were released at the same time, my mother um, had begun a process of this genealogy thing. Um, and I began to learn my family, my own heritage, my own um, and those two kind of converged as I would learn more about my great grandfather, of course, being a Dane, and my genealogy being of a Danish descent began to merge, and I began to see different um, kind of the ideology behind it all, behind our spirituality. And I really felt much more comforted in the information that I was receiving through these gifts. And that would lead me up until, well, really up until 2020, where I would have a vision in my backyard there in Anchorage, where I would come face to face and meet Odin. And he would explain to me my birthright and kind of explain to me now my path, my journey of what it meant and why it was here and why I needed to go through all that I went through to get to this place. And so from then to now, we've been involving ourselves in trances, communicating with the spirits, communicating with my ancestry, and gaining more and more knowledge to help people understand how our spiritual journey affects our everyday mental health. And so, lessons that I've certainly absorbed and given to many others now.
You kind of taken me on a journey of just thinking about the way that, let's just go, just use the word religion here, spreads throughout the world. And the big religions are religions that have a history of conquest. And so this conquest of Christianity in this case has created what people feel that they are generally born into, and they most certainly are. And Christ consciousness is a wonderful thing. But what has happened is that it has separated people from their ancestral rights. And I was doing a podcast the other day with a woman who was a Native American medicine woman, and she was talking about Christianity separating her from her ancestral faith. And I said, there's not much difference between you and me because it's done the same to me. My people are the Norse people, and that religion is something that I know very little about in a practical way. And she had to think about it for a second. She said, I suppose you're correct about that. That when conquest comes through, that's what names the prevailing social ideology and religious concepts of the area. And I think that Christianity has exactly what it is that you're talking about. It can feel very rules based,
It
and it
is.
can, and it distills itself down into rules. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, no, you didn't. You're wonderful. Um, what I was going to say is when you look at religion, religion is actually split into two sections. You have uh, a spiritual aspect to it, most certainly. And there are a few, um, even general practitioners, who will eventually get to this spiritual connection. But by and large, the largest part of a religion is its practice. And what I
Yes.
mean by the practice is the behavior modifications that are necessary to apply to our lives, right? So we're goody two shoes. We're, um, you know, crossing the street at the crosswalk. We're doing all the right things. That's a practice. The spiritual never tells you what to do. It incites you how to feel. There's a difference. A spiritual journey doesn't tell you rules. It doesn't give you these limitations, these boundaries. We have a creator above us and within us who guides us, but doesn't tell us what and how to do things. He does, or they do, enlighten us with a emotional connection that allows us to follow our hearts. And that is spirituality. Thou shalls does not belong in a spiritual belief.
Hmm. But the thou shalls are much more tangible and more simple to teach.
Yes, but they're also a way, if you go back in time and you look at why they were first implemented, we can certainly see that it was to direct and control populations. And that's why it was there. Our spiritual path is not controlled. There is a part of our spiritual path that must contain chaos. For you do not have order without chaos. It's all mediocre. And that's what we've kind of done with the spiritual journey. And you brought it up very earlier about this cultural blending, or what I like to call, actually, I can't coin it. My assistant actually coined it to me anyway, the vanillization, where we're just making everything vanilla, and we're stripping away this culture, we're stripping away the individuality to conform to this practice. And so I'm always reminded whenever I'm speaking of, I have a few friends who like myself were of the cloth, and they have decided in their infinite wisdom to instead be called Christians. They now want to be followers of Christ,
Yeah.
because Christians attaches the church, and the church is where they seem to think that this practice resides. Whereas a follower of Christ is more of a spiritual journey, which is different. And so, and that's, but they're still understanding the basic idea of getting away from this practice, this conform or die kind of mentality, and move it over to what is my spiritual path, and how am I connecting that? How am I feeling my way through my life? So
I
very important, and a
I
very
I
important distinction is what you're working with. Are you working up here, or are you working in your heart?
yeah, I and this when you were talking about the difference of the language that many uh, uh, followers of Christ are using now, I think there's definitely an effort to go deeper with spirit in it, because you hear a lot of, it's not a religion, it's a relationship, that
Right.
kind of thing, which I think is actually a good step in being sincere about the faith. But I also want to get back to your own conversion story, if you will, because there was a point at which you're a chaplain, you're working with these men who are coming home from war, and everybody comes home from war in some way damaged, and you're starting to see things that don't really conform to John 3:16. And is it disturbing to you? Is it confusing? What happens inside you?
I think that's exactly what it was. Is at first, you start saying, well, why do I even have these questions? Why, is my faith not strong enough? Am I not, what am I doing wrong? And so immediately the blame, of course, shifts to the self, right? Is, am I not doing enough? Am I not reading enough? Am I not practicing enough? What am I, not doing? What am I not doing? And and then you start rationalizing that. You get through the rationalization stage where you're kind of, well, it's, this is the retaliatory thinking, it's trying to break me down, and it's trying to break this apart. But then you start also, I came to a place where I said to myself, wait a minute, I've learned everything. Well, not everything, but I've learned quite a bit, right? I've studied. I spent, 2 years in seminary. I did the things that were necessary. Why doesn't this make sense? Well, wait, maybe it's not the fact that it's me, that I'm just not smart enough, or I'm not putting the right parts together, but maybe this doctrine doesn't work for me. So then you start asking some base questions. I one of the practices of the church was, um, if you haven't heard the word, you're condemned to hell, and if you don't believe in the word, you're condemned to hell. What about the people that were around before the word was here? What about them? And you start now you're beginning to diverge in what you're studying. You're starting to say, okay, well, why didn't this process, this thought, this line of thought, why didn't it occur before it did? And then along that, as you're investigating that, you come to this place where you, um, well, why didn't these people along the way, why didn't they immediately jump on board and believe everything and just subscribe? Why did they try to hold on to their own beliefs? And so now the question, or the quest for more knowledge, is now beginning to move outside the self. And you're saying, wait a minute, maybe there's something else going on here. And this is where, in my mind, I began to find holes in the doctrine for me. And then many years later, like I said, about 2016, I would meet my grandfather in a trance. And one of the things that he would tell me, or taught me, was that if something doesn't make sense to you from a belief system perspective, if it doesn't make sense, then why subscribe? If it doesn't feel 100% right in your heart, why are you following this then? Because obviously you're not congruent with whatever this belief is. If there's questions and you can't seem to find an answer either through prayer or through study, maybe that doesn't work for you. The other thing that I would come to learn was this idea that we're all different. I know that's a novel idea, but we're all different. We come from very different places. We come from a very different connection. And we certainly have a very different emotional range that works for us uniquely. And so for the first time then, like I said, around 2016, 2017, I realized that, wait a minute, Christianity as this entity can be right for certain people, but it doesn't have to be right for me. And so at that point, I began to study other uh, understandings, whether that been I studied the laws of Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Confucianism, um, finally arriving at many of the indigenous beliefs. Um, Going back to when I was a young boy, I lived just outside and next to a Navajo man, a wonderful man, whom began to enlighten me. Although back then it didn't really make as much sense as it did now that I was looking at my spiritual path from his perspective. And as I began more and more to understand that, I really began to feel called by my ancestors and my uh, connection to the Norse, to the Celtic Norse, really is more of an acknowledgement of my heritage, my ancestry, in knowing that, hey, these people were my ancestors. What did they seek? What were they in constant quest for? What were they looking for? And so I began to have those same quests and same desires to understand and grow. And that's really where we arrive at a full changeover in our thinking and certainly my spiritual path.
Mm. You know, I'm thinking about my own upbringing. I was raised in the Mormon church, and there was it's very, very rules based, and there is a constant pressure to say this is the only true church. This is the only true this and that, which is makes it extremely fragile because all you have to do is discover one discrepancy and you go, "Wait a minute. Everything is supposed to be true there." And so it's based upon things that are very fragile, very breakable. A lot of the way that religion is practiced now in by these groups. And as you were having this awakening in yourself and beginning to question things, was there a social price that you paid? Were there friendships that were endangered? Was it hard?
Yes. I made several comments when I left the church and kind of made my formal announcement that I was leaving because my beliefs didn't align anymore. Um, my shield maiden actually received death threats.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it was very volatile, very painful. Um, we were very much ostracized, and so yeah, no, it was very painful.
You know, it's interesting.
But I had to follow my heart.
Of
I
course you do.
couldn't cave and say, okay, all right, you win, because my heart was telling me where I needed to be. Don't get me wrong, my shield maiden, we've been married 35 years. Bless her. Her patience, she deserves sainthood. Um, and she is a follower of Christ. She subscribes to that. Why? Because it works for her. But we also understand when she looks at this figure that she calls God or Yahweh, I look at that same figure, but I just call him Odin. It's they're one and the same. And so many people are so demanding of finding differences instead of trying to find unity and harmony. Is how I can look at your God, or whom you call a God, and say, oh, that's equal to my God, goddess, whoever, right? So I say, oh, you have a divine feminine God, goddess. That's wonderful. Let me tell you about Freya. Freya, of course, being a goddess to me, she represents the divine feminine, which is a very equal and powerful part to the gods like Odin and Thor and Balder and those men whom provide a masculine energy, Freya and Frigg and Idun. These goddesses provide an equal and um, complementary energy that allows us to be successful.
Welcome to the Mindful Mutiny Podcast. I'm Jeremy, and I founded Mindful Mutiny as a podcast, a community, and a commitment to live a high frequency life. I want to help you cultivate purpose, clarity, and structure. I'm an experienced therapist, transformational coach, former executive, and psychedelic specialist. Go to mindfulmutiny.com to subscribe to my newsletter, schedule a consultation, or just to get more information about what my coaching can do for you. If you support positivity, I'd be honored to have you as a Patreon subscriber. On Patreon, there will be bonus material and a community of Mindful Mutiny fans that believe in human potential and living a high-value life. Also, check out the link in the description for my spring store with merchandise that supports the Mindful Mutiny podcast. Mindful Mutiny is sponsored by Exponential Intelligence. Exponential Intelligence teaches you how to raise your consciousness and be the most wise, evolved, and brilliant version of yourself. See the link in the description of this podcast to learn more about this incredible sponsor. Mindful Mutiny is also sponsored by Pachamama Sacred Paths. Pachamama's mission is to facilitate individual awakening through sacred plant medicine, spiritual retreats, and ancient teachings, ultimately contributing to the collective ascension of consciousness. With over a decade of experience hosting retreats, Pachamama is distinguished by its commitment to ancient wisdom, shamanic practice, and ethical care for participants. See the link in the description of this podcast to learn more about this incredible sponsor. So my next question for you is about the precepts of the Norse religion. Christianity is that the person gains access to the Most High through his Son, who is one with him, and that the sacrifice of the cross is what pays the price for the innate sinfulness of the individual, that the individual sees in his or her vision only Christ, and that Christ is the Alpha and the Omega, and that he the person goes to heaven through the path of Christ worship and relationship. And so, how how is the Norse religion the same or different and different?
Well, I think there's certainly a similarity in path. Obviously, um, in my vernacular, we don't use the word heaven, and certainly the words Christ and the Father and all those things. But the path of ascension, following our physical release of our physical form back to the spiritual realm, is that we'll go and we'll stand before Skald, and Skald will review our tapestry sewn by Verdandi. And from that tapestry, we will be invited to reside in one of the great halls of Asgard or in the other realms until Ragnarok, of course, where all is reborn to fight in this final battle to destroy the evil or the unwanted spirits of the realms. The idea that your life is being judged based on what you do and how you act in society is certainly against much of Norse legend. Legends and stories of the Norse speak of living a life of honor. Everything to the Norse was about your honor, and the idea of being outlawed was a fate worse than death to the Norse. But this tapestry, and I learned this fairly early, and I'm so glad I did. But this tapestry that's actually sewn by Verdandi, the youngest of the Norner sisters, and certainly the future identified by the fates of the Greek understanding. She sews a tapestry of our lives, but not of the adventures, not of the conquests, which is what everybody, and even I, thought was, but more importantly, how I responded to these experiences that I had in my life. How I responded um, when someone said, "Oh, you're dirty," or "You're a horrible person," whatever. How I responded to that and how I allowed that negative energy to affect my thinking about me and about my interaction. How I reacted or responded to that is what gets sewn in the tapestry. That tapestry and those responses in our lives are then evaluated against the 9 noble virtues of the Norse: honor, courage, truthfulness, hospitality, generosity, all of these things that we should be doing during our lives. And then we're kind of invited to go spend eternity in one of these halls, or at least until Ragnarok. Now, in my case, there was a covenant that was signed. It's a legal document. It's in the records of a covenant in 748. And that covenant bound all of the different Ulfhethnar groups together under one big banner, so to speak. And under that covenant, we are given direct access to Tirzal, Vladskaf, and there we will reside until. So I don't really go through the evaluation process at the end. So my tapestry, albeit very important to me in the afterlife, I'm not going to be judged by what's on that tapestry. I'll be judged because I signed a blood right to be a part of the Ulfhethnar, and that is according to this covenant, I will reside at this hole until Ragnarok.
Hmm.
So it's
And
not really certainly one of the things that comes across in Norse thinking and Norse understanding is the whole process of life. And when you get to it, when our spiritual entity, our spiritual self, is bonded to our physical form, the eldest of the three Norner sisters, Erd tells us the lifespan, how long we're going to be in this physical form, and we agree to that, right? So whatever that is, whatever that looks like, we agree to that date, and then we have Skald at the end when our spiritual self leaves our physical form, ascends into the spiritual realm. We meet with Skald, and Skald then, using the tapestry, we get to one of the holes. What they mention is the dash. The dash is that line that exists between our birth year and our death year. That dash is our life, is the entirety of our consciousness and the experiences that we will have within this physical form, is that dash. And that dash is for us to drive, for us to manage, maintain, control, and do the right things as often as we can. Does that mean that we have to be goody two shoes? No. Does that mean that we're never going to make a mistake, and if we do, we have to go through this whole rigmarole? No. Mistakes are a part of life. You will learn more by a mistake than you will ever by getting it right the first time. It is by our mistakes and by our missteps that we learn our true path, or we have to stumble at which to walk. It's just what it is. So the dash, the Norse have always believed, understand, the dash is up to us to make decisions responding to events that are occurring in our life, responding to them appropriately to these 9 noble virtues. And so that's kind of the Norse thinking versus the certainly the Christian teachings.
Yeah, it feels interwoven into everyday decisions, mindset, and responses,
Right.
quite integrally. And
Right.
and can you
It's
talk?
much more indigenous in its orientation.
Yeah.
Because if you look at some of these indigenous practices of indigenous groups throughout the world, not just of Americas, but certainly of the world, you really see more of a, yeah, you have to make these decisions. You have to do these actions, but it's because you want to, not because you have to. It's because you feel compelled to do that. There's no have tos. There's no you should and you will and you shalls. There's none of that. There's, do you want to do this? Yes, no, maybe. And that's what drives our path.
Well, and so you're a former pastor and now you carry the title of shaman. And can you talk about what you do as a shaman, how you became one?
Well, the journey to being a shaman is long, and I'm going to caveat by saying others have called me now a shaman.
Okay.
This is not one of those titles that I said, hey, that one looks good. I'll use that one.
Right.
So others have referred to me as shaman. Why? Because according to the definitions, I've met the criteria. But more importantly, I consider myself a teacher and a conduit. Um, I I communicate with the spirits of both this plane and that one, and I help to formulate those spiritual thoughts into ways to help people obtain a better mental health, better mental space that they can then use some good old thought process, heart measuring, and make right decisions for them and their families, and find happiness and find joy. My journey to shaman has been enlightening in that when I first started with trances, I first started falling into trance and being able to get into a trance state. I felt way out of place. I felt like I was faking it. I felt like maybe I'm making up this information or making up these thoughts, or, you know, but then I started to think about things that I had never thought about. Things like, one of the lessons I've had in my life is the passage of energy, how energy moves around through our bodies, through our minds, through our hearts, how that energy is then transferred between one and another. And we really got into, I was explaining this to someone, and he said, wow, that sounds like quantum science. It sounds like quantum physics at its core, what you're saying right now. And I was like, well, okay, if that's what it helps you. Um, but when you really, some of these journeys that I would go on in trances, I would gain all types of intellect and knowledge, which would ultimately construct my wisdom about things that before the trances I had no idea about. Um, Visits in physiology, all right? How does the body respond to a reaction? How does it react? What is the actual functionality of how the body releases hormones into the system so that we can recognize it as an emotion? I, I didn't know that stuff. So I began to have thoughts about things that had never entered my thought process before. And that's, I think, where I really began to understand that this wasn't stuff I was bringing up. This wasn't something that I had read somewhere, where I had watched a TV show about, and all of a sudden I was the resident expert. Nope. This was stuff that was coming from other sources outside of me, educating me as to how I can help people to understand their own mental journeys. So that's really where I think it hit me that I needed to step outside the church, obviously, but then I began to have this much larger feelings that um, I just needed to conduit that stuff, that knowledge from me to the listeners and viewers of the world. Yeah, as far as what I do a multitude of things. Too much sometimes, my shield maiden always says. Um, but for the most part, I teach. I'm a spiritual teacher, and the good news is that when I'm teaching and we're talking about some of these universal truths, it doesn't really matter what religious jersey you're wearing. You can come in and we'll speak of things like love and brotherhood and family and harmony with other people, and we'll talk about the mental processes as to how you can reduce your anxiety, rid yourself of depression, and begin to look for these things that bring joy and happiness into your life, and how that has a ripple effect. So if I'm super happy about my life and everything going on in it, those ripples will then affect, you know, my partner, my life partner, whoever that, in my case, my shield maiden, my children, my friends, and everyone begins to feel these ripples, even if they don't know why, even if they don't understand why, they're beginning to feel those ripples, and they begin to process that energy within their own minds. And we can become this catalyst for joy and peace and harmony with our fellow humans. And that's really my teachings. I do rituals. I teach people a little differently than what many people would say. Oh, this is a ritual and this is a ritual. I do rituals from here, not from here. Um, so when I perform birth blessings or pregnancy blessings, or um, every now and then I have the honor of officiating a wedding. Um, Sometimes I'll lead congregations or groups through, just almost a revival, if you will, lot more so than say a sermon or something like that. So I do healing. I have several patients whom patients is such a horrible term. I'll use the term friends. I have several friends whom I either through herbal remedies or through magical healings, I'll offer them some pain relief and some ways for them to begin to recover their lives. And for the most part, and I would say 60% of every day is spent communicating with veterans who are returning from service, both here in the U.S. and abroad, um, and to help them to find peace in this craziness of their PTSD.
Yeah, I really want to get into this because your doctrine, your doctorate. What is your doctorate in?
My doctors, not doctorate, doctors is in ministry.
Okay, okay. And you help people with psychological trauma.
I
You
do.
work with people. It sounds like you've been doing that for a really long time. It sounds like you have a kind of like a special way that you do that kind of work. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. It is my pride and joy. Um, but getting people, the first, the first thing where I kind of have an advantage over some of my colleagues is this whole alpha male thing. We got to get through that, right? Because our first line of defense is our ego, is our bravado, and these top level, top tier military members who are returning from combat, who have seen some crazy things. That's the first nut you have to crack when dealing with those types of things. Is we got to remember, we're human under all that bulletproof armor and everything that makes us, you know, this top tier military specialist. We're still human, and so we got to get through that. Once we can get through that, then we can begin to understand. And what I do is I teach emotional understanding. What makes emotion? How do we as humans create emotion? And then how does our brain interpret that emotion to then alter our behaviors, our thought process, all of those things? And then one of the later steps is that we begin to remember that the brain is trainable. We trained the brain to be negative or fear-based or whatever. And now we have to change that programming and change the programming to look for things that bring us joy, things that bring us peace, things that bring us harmony. And so we begin to target and kind of restore this ability for the individual to then have control over how they're interpreting their world, which then allows us to clear up some of this bandwidth that we have in our brain. If we can get some headspace, a little bit of space over this trauma, we can begin to think about it, and we then chunk it down into manageable bites that then we can deal with. We can build these, what I call living mechanisms in our lives that helps us to deal with those things. So we're not always driven by, we're not triggered or emotionally reacting. We're dropping that down just a tad, and we're putting a little thought into it so that we can respond, not react, respond. It's more of a cognitive thing. So kind of gives that thought process. So that's the whole kind of at 10,000 foot. That's kind of how it looks.
So it's both things together. It's psychological and it's spiritual how you work with people. And I've as a trained mental health person myself, it's remarkable to me how there has been through the years much more of a BF Skinnering of psychology, where the spirit is removed from so much of what is considered kind of animalistic functioning of the brain, if you will. And we have this huge resource of spirit in ourself and a mental health system that is almost embarrassed to go there. Yet people are needing this.
I agree. And what, and I think about it in the same way that I think about the medical community. And I bless my doctors. I had back surgery a couple of months ago. I'm there. I love you guys, and I needed you then. But a lot of times, many humans in general are very quick to jump on board with this, the medical and certainly the mental health community. And we forget we have a solution built in. We can do this. We can heal ourselves. We can mend what's broken up here. We can do this. But we're quick to kind of pass responsibility to others. And I think that's where some of the struggles that we have. One of the things that I hear all the time is I do herbal remedies, right? And I make them right here at my house, or I should say right there at my house back in Anchorage. And I make these herbal remedies and I offer them to people. And I say, hey, if you got, you're getting headaches every day, whatever the case, I'd like you to try using this for, a couple of days and tell me if you any difference. Well, they come back to me a week later and they say, I need more of this. This is absolutely working. I absolutely require it. Okay. What I want you to do though is I want you to make your own. Oh, I can't do that. This is way too. Go to the store and buy yourself dried lettuce. What? Go to your store and buy dried lettuce. Okay. Buy the dried lettuce. All right. I want you to take olive oil. I want you to put those two in a container and let it sit for X amount of time. Okay. They do that. They whip it up and they've made a natural remedy for themselves. And that is nature's pain relief right there. It's wild lettuce leaves dried with either virgin olive oil or I use 80% alcohol, little dropper bottles, 3 droppers, 3 times a day. Pain goes away. How can it be that easy? Because It is that easy. These are the remedies that your ancestors were using, and it worked just fine. So, and mental health, same thing. When we train our brain, sometimes our training is really good, and we train our brain to focus on the negative, to focus on the bad parts. And what happens when we do that is that we can simply put blinders on. We're going to train ourselves to put blinders on, and we're not going to see those things that are joyful and wonderful around us because we're too focused looking for the negativity, looking for the bad. um, and so what I do is I train people, and I have several exercises I do with my friends to help them to train their brain to stop looking for the negatives. Because, yes, we know they're out there, right? They're out there in abundance. All these negative things, these negative energies are out there, but so are positive ones. So are light energy. It's as abundant, if not more so, than the negative ones. We're too busy focused on the negative. I train them to look for the good. I train them to celebrate the wins, to celebrate their steps, and that begins to build self-confidence, self-worth, self-value, and they begin to kind of reinvest in themselves, and that's where you reobtain mental control.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting where that comes from in the psyche. And I think it's rather intrinsic to the way that the human is built to focus on negative things as opposed to the abundance of positive things to focus on. And it's it can get overwhelming for people, particularly in trauma.
It does. And you know, when I break down trauma and I explain it in such a way that we're saying, oh, here's this, here's your tube, if you will, of all the stuff your brain can process at one moment, and you're letting these little, I call them tiddlywink things, kind of build up these little stressors. I'm not living in accordance to what I could be. I'm not living up. I have a low self value. All of these things are building up here. And then we get this event that comes in, and it's this monstrous trauma. Well, we've taken up some spaces with these little stresses that we didn't really need to. And now we have this monster trauma coming in. There's simply no bandwidth. There's no bandwidth for us to process this massive trauma. So what you wind up with is physiological failures, right? I mean, we can physiologically start shutting down our body because the brain can't handle all of this at the same time, or it thinks it can't. Probably a better idea. It thinks it can't. And what we have to do is we have to identify this trauma, reduce it just enough to where we get some headspace up here, just a little bit of headspace at the top where we can apply some cognitive thought and we can chunk it up, right? Because that's really makes it a lot more tackleable, right? Is that when we can say, oh, instead of tacking this whole mountain, we're going to just get to this face right now. We'll get to the face and then we'll decide what we're going to do with the next hill or the next whatever, right? So if we can chunk this thing down to a manageable level, we can apply our cognitive thoughts to chunk it up, we can deal with it. And that's really what these exercises are meant to do is we just go through this process of breaking things down to help people deal with it.
Hmm. I'd like to get into something that shouldn't be a difficult thing to talk about, but maybe it is. I don't know. And it has to do with ethnic Northern European people, and that all of Europe is considered Christian, and Christianity obviously coming from the desert regions of the northern Middle East now,
Mm-hmm.
a different landscape, a different people, and precepts that are good overall, but the the northern European people have in essence, been kind of separated from this spirituality that grounds them to their ancestors, to the earth, to the seasons, and that it's not necessarily that Christianity doesn't necessarily completely speak to the heart and soul of the Northern European experience, certainly not historically. And so, can you talk about the growing interest in Norse spirituality, where you see it going, and what it is doing in the hearts of people who may have felt kind of spiritually homeless, in that the only available spirituality is the church down the street? And it's been that way for hundreds of years.
I think you've touched on a few things there, and the first thing I'll talk about is obviously when we look at the spread of Christianity into Scandinavia, we're talking, and the scope obviously is probably not as clear, but we're talking almost 1,000 years of we're talking, well, actually, no, it's more like five. Well, there were missionaries, emissaries, before we got to the modern era, who were speaking of, um, you know, this idea of Judaism at the time. Um, so they were talking about this whole one God thing. When you see emissaries, now you also have to remember that my people, the Danes, we traveled quite frequently, ranging all the way from deep within Russia all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. So we were trading all over there. Lots of interactivity that may not be as highlighted in history books. So there was a lot of talk about this understanding. Now, when you think about the conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity, Dane or Denmark, what is today Denmark, would be first, right? And they would become Christian to align themselves to the European markets at the time. They were needing trading partners and the like. So Denmark would go first, then Sweden, and then finally, we call them the crazy third child of Norway. So they were they were the holdouts. Um, but anyway, so you see these people converting, not really for again for the ideology, not really for the beliefs, but more for trading, and certainly getting the markets going. They needed to buy and sell, so, with the European markets. So that's really where we see Christianity kind of run over Scandinavia, and then and that would go all the way into the UK and beyond, obviously, to where it is today. So we really have, but we're talking about a time frame that modern day people uh, struggle to wrap their minds around, and we're talking 500 years of interactivity. Um, I mean, we're not talking. Denmark didn't convert over until almost, I think, 1100s, somewhere in there, 1200s. So, and you had emissaries that were starting before we actually got to the year one. So we had interactivity going on. So we're talking a lot of years gone by that, quite frankly, the United States has been in reality for what, 200, 270. So, so there's a difference there. There's a time frame that I don't think is calculated as frequently. I also think that, what many people say is this overwhelming just changeover, that made immediately every citizen in Denmark a Christian when the royal family was converted. That's not reality. Reality is you had pockets of non-believers um, all around, even in Denmark. Yeah, I mean, even probably in the royal family within reason, I would think. So it wasn't a sweeping conversion, so to speak. And so some of these ideas and thoughts and concepts and beliefs would be kind of transported out, particularly amongst the traveling Vikings, um, and would be all around the world. I also think what you're also seeing is a very indigenous way of thinking. If you get all the way back to the way I worship and certainly the way I live my life, is it's very indigenous in its orientation. It's very natural. It's very easy. There's no requirements. I just live my life, and I do the best I can, and sometimes I do better than others. But I just live my life, and I speak with my gods. I speak with my ancestors, and but it's just living our lives. As far as modern people are concerned when coming to Norse understanding, the first thing I think you always get the alpha males who are coming over, and I say alpha males. There are alpha females too, so I didn't mean to leave anybody out. But the alpha personality who's going to be drawn to this thinking by the Vikings, right? I mean, the whole lore and legend around the Vikings, they have a tendency to stir everyone into some form of order or some form of action. So it's that lore teamed up with, I think, the not strict requirements of these modern practices, who say you got to go every Sunday, you got to put something in the plate, you got to behave this way, you got to do this. One of the jokes my grandfather told me was that we really liked dealing with the gods of the Norse because, unlike what we hear in Christianity and modern monotheistic, is that they were flawed. They screwed things up a lot. They made errors. They made mistakes. They got too drunk. They did this. They did that. They made mistakes. They were flawed. What does that mean? That means it's okay for me to be flawed. If my gods are flawed, I should be able to be flawed, right? Whereas with, some Christian thinking, you know, perfect in every way, I can't live up to that bar, to that measure. I'm a goofball. When I'm not being serious and being a shaman, I'm a total goofball. I ride motorcycles. I swear like a sailor when I'm at home. And it's okay because, like my gods, I have flaws. It is who I am. So I think um, mono, modern people see that, and they say, here's these gods who are messing stuff up all the time, who are stumbling over their own feet sometimes, and that kind of allows me to be human. And I think that's the draw, particularly after we get past the ego bravado group of attaching to swords and shields and the things of the Vikings. I think the ease of just living our lives, we don't need a whole bunch of anything. And this idea that it's okay to be human, to make mistakes, to make these errors, and live with those, learn, grow, move on. And I think that's the draw of the modern attachment to and I don't think the Norse obviously a lot more fame and fortune because of some television shows that have been airing, particularly over the last couple of years. So I think it's really picked up in popularity, but I don't see that as being any different than being understanding your ancestry in Greece or Egypt or any of the other indigenous beliefs of the lands. I don't see it as being any different. So,
Hmm. If somebody's interested in learning more about this and getting literature on it, what would you recommend people be reading?
reading. Wow. Yeah. Let me caveat everything by saying I have a very good friend um, who has his own website, has his own YouTube channel, and he does an amazing job at interpreting the culture and some of the beliefs and the certainly some of the spiritual understandings of the Norse people. And he's his ancestry comes from Norway. So I can't I've got to be, you know, I struggle, but I love him anyway. He's a wonderful man and he has a wonderful message. Produces a wonderful image of the culture and the beliefs of the Norse. And so he's at norseimports.com and he does some amazing stuff. And like I say, he has a YouTube channel where he talks about culture and the stuff that goes with it. Um, but as far as reading goes, we have to be very selective in our reading when we talk about the Norse beliefs and understandings, and take what we read that's even available in the most reliable bookstores on the planet. We have to be very cautious. Is much of what we know of the Norse by accord is written by a converted priest, Snorri Sturluson, who is an Icelander, and he wrote the sagas that we all know to be the holy books of the Norse belief systems, and he wrote them roughly around 1200. So 200 years had already passed from the age of the Vikings. So I can only begin to express my appreciation for what he did right, because some of it has been proven in archaeological finds around the world, but he's writing it with a Christian slant. And so you kind of have to take what you read and go, okay, yeah, okay, kind of nod your way through it. But think of, as you're reading anything about the Norse, think about looking at the same information from an indigenous thought process. And that's sometimes difficult, which leads us to a whole nother set of books to read. um, just to kind of get that mindset to where you're looking at, why would someone believe this, whatever this is, if they didn't have anything else? If they were in their home in the middle of winter and they were just thinking about gods, what would they what would that mean? What would that be? And so really looking at in my case, I looked at my Norse ancestry and back traced it back to where it actually came from. And the Norse beliefs and understanding actually came from the migration north of the Celts. The Celts of the Iberian Peninsula would migrate first they would migrate east, and then they would migrate north through what is or what was Germania, or what is today Germany. And in my case, my ancestors would settle just south of what's the Elbe River in Denmark, or oh, it's actually in Germany. Um, and but then above the Elbe River was the March of the Danes, or Denmark. And but it would take us 100 years, 100, 200 years, almost the lifespan of the United States, to migrate north over that river. I've the pictures I've seen of it, for a group of people who supposedly built these beautiful longships, I would have thought the river would be fairly easy to get across, but it took us about 200 years to get over that river. And then once we got over the river, um, my ancestry would march north. As they marched north, they might have evicted a couple of people along the way, and then my family actually settled in a town called Bjerby. Bjerby is 6 kilometers short of being in the North Sea, and 6 kilometers, it's 6 kilometers east from being in the North Sea that way. So, um, but of course, we know the clan known as the Danes would actually march all the way through what is today Denmark. Denmark, of course, the word Denmark translates to the March of the Danes. So that's where you actually get the word Denmark from. So, but it actually came from the Celts, and the Celts, of course, a very indigenous people, grew up, and so that's where those beliefs come from.
Well,
So
here's the part.
reading would be tough.
Well, yeah, it sounds like it.
Need a whole library.
And here's the part in the podcast where I tell you what I love about you. I love your deep soul searching that has taken an entire lifetime for you to come to, and a great deal of bravery to embrace. I love that what you do is teach the world about this indigenous spirituality in a manner that embodies humility and learning and understanding of how these precepts are relevant to modern life. I love how you help human beings who are struggling. And I love how, just in our conversations, this one and the one that you and I had privately before this, there's this built-in sense of care, nurturing, and sensitivity that is so uniquely yours. And it feels like it's taken a lifetime for you to really feel truly in this space of embracing this spirituality, because we're raised in a very different kind of world than what our ancestors were raised in. And so for you to bring this powerful, meaningful spirituality into the modern age and teach people how powerful it is, how important it is, the difference in it versus other more predominant spiritualities, I think it's exceedingly important for you to be doing this, because I feel like there's a lot of people who feel very spiritually homeless
I agree.
because there's predominant spiritual thought with which they do not resonate. And so the way that you bring this forward is it I I love it, because I feel like I understand so much more about it than I did an hour ago. And I thank you for that. I'm really, really excited to get to know more about it, about my own history, about my own ancestral roots. And so thank you for bringing this forward in a way that is humble, and in a way that is so relevant to life.
I agree. I just want to correct you with one statement you made,
Sure.
and firstly I want to say thank you. You Thank you so much for those kind words. But let's be cautious about using different spirituals or different spiritualities. There is no different spiritualities.
Mm.
There's a different understanding of that spirituality. And that is what's so unique to each and every one of us, is that how we understand what we're processing. But the spiritual core, the spirits of the lands, the gods, the spirits of all living things on this planet, um, those remain constant. So they're always going to be there for you. When you're ready, you will find a way to communicate with them, and they will communicate with you.
Thank you. And how do people get in touch with you?
Well, there's all kinds of ways. I have a television show, I have YouTube shows, I have all kinds of things. But the best way to get a hold of me and to communicate with me is through my website, akolfhefnar.com. But because it's so impossible to spell, my webmaster, in his infinite wisdom, decided to also include NorseWhispers.com.
That is so
So
much better.
it is. For Americans, it's so much easier. Um, and so there at NorseWhispers.com, you can find all about my message, about me, about all our shows, about all the things that we're doing and involved in. Is just a ton of information. Very crowded website, by the way. Um, but nonetheless, it's there, and you can also scroll all the way to the bottom, and on the left side, there's a big orange button that says Ask Me a Question. They are more than welcome to ask questions, and I try to respond to every email I get. Um, we do a show on Wednesday nights on YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and on New Reality TV, where it's a live show where I answer one question that's been posed through that button, and we answer the question, and whoever's question I make a show out of, I send them a free T-shirt for them to have, so they can wear it. You know, everyone needs a change of clothes, so we offer a free T-shirt. Anyway, I can't do pants because everything's going to make my butt look big. So we just do T-shirts. So um, but they're welcome to ask questions. We can communicate. We can start actually. They can sign up for life coaching. All of that's available on that website. So that's the
That's
best way.
wonderful. We'll have that information in the description of this episode. And thank you so much for taking all of this time to be a guest here on Mindful Mutiny.
Well, I appreciate being in a warm truck out here in Bethel. So it's nice. I like it.
And anybody who plans to travel to Bethel, Alaska, please give Mark a ring.
I can tell you the two hot spots, and that's it. They're both on the main street, so you can't miss them really.
Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the Mindful Mutiny podcast. Leave a comment, leave a review. That is how this whole thing grows, and I get to bring more of this wonderful content to you. And remember, in a lifetime, there are more decisions than anybody could count. Living the highest form of yourself is the most rewarding thing that you can do. Make incredible, positive, risky, and bold decisions to be the highest version of you. Now go be something great.